Thank you for coming. Thank you for the workshop, for organizing this. I realize it's a slightly unorthodox workshop in that you haven't read anything, or maybe you have. I don't know. I mean, there's some pre-circulated text, that's all. And we're discussing a book. I read it over the break. I really enjoyed it. I'm grateful to be here with Professor John Wallach, who is at Hunter and here at the Graduate Center. It's especially timely. I also read over the break How Democracies Die, which I don't know if you've read, but I thought was very well written and makes sense that it was on the bestseller list. There's some crossover, I think we can think about.
Actually, I haven't read that book. So.
Oh, okay.
And I know it was reviewed in the recent issue of Perspectives on Politics, and
okay.
review of it, but I haven't read it since I figured we were on the same planet. Anyways, go ahead. Intellectual.
Part of the project here is to think about, to historicize 5 constellations or constitutive features of Western liberal democracy. There's been a lot of attention, so in that book anyway, to sort of the institutional flaws of American government, right? Can a sitting president be indicted? Can he or she pardon herself? There's been less attention to the normative social practices required for a government to function, for collective ethical life. One of the indications of this is the increasing political polarization today. I teach from a textbook, I teach American government, and one of the favorite statistics is I think in the 50s, 30% of Democrats and Republicans said that they'd be disappointed if their child married somebody from the other party. And today, 70% of people say they're afraid of people who support the other party. So maybe we can think about this polarization today and why Trump maybe is not really an anomaly in a lot of ways. So the central claim here is that, 2 central claims, that democracies aren't self-legitimating, that is in practice and ergo, or self-justifying in logos, and rather as works of progress, as democracies as works of progress. One of the tasks of critical theory is to elaborate and make explicit this theory-praxis relationship. For Professor Wallach and those in the Discourse this means overcoming a Kantian dualism, maintained in realist and liberal theories such as Rawls and the original position and Habermas' communicative rationality. An historicist approach to such constitutive features as civil rightness, this is one of the constellations, and representation, another, highlights instead the politics of collective action. That is, logos, is always already praxis. Reason is not sovereign, but always dependent on an external, socially mediated world. So rather than beginning with theory, Professor Wallach's Discourses project begins with their social cultural practices in an attempt at making explicit what Hegel calls our inorganic nature. In other words, right, those experiences that always precede the possibility of knowledge. So I'll save my questions then to the end.
Okay.
And let you take off.
Okay, I just have one small comment about the inorganic character of what I'm doing, because, right, the more literal understanding of something that's inorganic is that it's dead. But I won't go there. So we'll just
definitely not dead.
Yeah,
maybe dying.
Okay, so yeah, this is indeed an unusual political theory workshop. The organizer of the political theory workshop is the presenter, and that's not so good. No one should be judged in his own cause. And here we're the litigant, advocate, judge, and jury are conflated in the presenter. So, but let's set that aside. And the political theory workshop collective decided it would be appropriate and useful to have me talk about my recently published book, Democracy and Goodness, a Historicist Political Theory, and it's still 20% off from Cambridge University Press until December 31st. I guess it's always 20% off on Amazon. So let me say a little bit about the motivations for the problematic posed by the book. Yes, indeed, as Tristan said, I started out with the assumption, which actually made sense to me from an aspect of Plato that I found true, and that is that democracy does not produce its own conception of virtue or goodness or ethics or anything like that. It has to reach outside itself. So, and it's important that it does reach outside itself. And this means that there is going to be some sort of ethical discourse that's related to democracy all the time, and this ethical discourse needs to serve the role of justifying and explaining democracy as a decent political order. The problem is that if ethics is associated with democracy, it can easily be reified. It can easily be reified in terms of an authoritarian conception of what is the good, that regulates what the people want to do, or it can be collapsed into sort of an arrogant understanding that democracy is automatically good. And neither of those were acceptable to me. So I decided that the way to understand the way in which one could legitimate and justify democracy, which I think is a good idea in general, is to look at ways in which democracies, loosely understood, have always connected their own work to specific concepts at different periods of history. That just was a kind of discovery on my part as a way of trying to make sense of what I did in terms of my teaching. But let me just look at this. And so in order to go into this, the way in which democracy needed to self-legitimate and justify itself in a way that maintains its own democratic character, I decided that I needed to go to history because actually contemporary political theory wasn't much help. Whether or not it was liberalism in the Rawlsian vein, conservatism in the Straussian or McIntyrean vein. We won't talk about reactionary conservatism because I don't like to. And or in a sort of radical leftist vein, which tends to dismiss ethical questions. And I have always thought that one of the problems of the left in politics is not that its ideals were wrong, but that it didn't know how to connect to people that we didn't already agree with. And I thought that that was something that was important for my understanding. And one of the ways that I could sort of peg this project was by looking at two columnists for the New York Times who have been writing forever, 15 years at least, Paul Krugman and David Brooks. David Brooks always deals with ethical issues. He never mentions capitalism, or if he does, I mean, David Brooks has been moving to the left slowly, but he still doesn't mention capitalism. He still doesn't talk about power or inequality when he talks about his interest in how we should all be nicer to each other. And Krugman is very good in his economic critiques, but he often doesn't, explain why is it that people don't agree with him. What's the resistance to this? So in some ways, what I am doing in the book is to provide a scholarly tool for democratic politics, even though that's not the official cover story. But it's designed to help us understand and improve democracy in the 21st century. And when I talk about democracy, I really talk about it in a strictly kind of neutral linguistic way, namely the authoritative power by the demos. If there's authoritative power exercised by the demos, there's democracy. Now, the only time in which there really ever was a democracy was when women were excluded from politics and slaves were accepted. So since then, there have been various guises to hide the fact that societies that are called democratic actually aren't democratic. Although, in fact, the Federalists were quite blunt in saying that the Constitution is not a democratic document. And I was astonished to realize this when I learned about it as an undergraduate. But we all know this now, if only because we have experienced the results of the power of the Senate, which is disproportionate in terms of the population, voter suppression, the Electoral College, right, which has twice in the last 2 decades elected a president who was a minority president, and we don't really live in a democratic society in that sense. But I do want to keep the word and not just regard it as a ideology, as Marx sort of started to do towards the middle. It's so ridiculous to talk about the Communist Manifesto as the middle of his life, but you know, he was 25. Anyway, wait a second, 1840, no, he's 30, so it's 30. So my interest is looking at this sort of complements to democracy that have to do with ethics and don't harm, and whose utility in democratic action don't harm democracy. And the other references to contemporary thinking is that we often talk about liberal democracy, but what liberalism tends to, liberalism doesn't have a theory of power in and of itself. It just talks about accommodating difference and being reasonable and, you know, and sort of attending Rawls's seminar at Harvard. You know, you just, and same thing with Habermas. I mean, it's just, you know, the ideal speech situation. And the thing is that it doesn't really imagine or understand how reasonableness in politics is inflected by power considerations. And so, for me, liberalism is always a disguise. All this notion of reasonableness is sometimes the Supreme Court always trots out when it makes decisions is always just a way of saying in a elegant way the kind of mistake that undergraduates often make in papers, which is to say obviously. If you ever say obviously in a paper, remember, cut it out. Right? Because the only utility of using the word obviously is to insult the person that you're talking to. Right? I mean, it doesn't explain anything. It just emphasizes the fact that you already should know something. Okay, so now but liberal reasonableness was always a problem because it didn't understand the way in which its own reasonableness, its own ethical legitimacy was inflected by power, which it didn't really take into account very well. And there was a critique of this in the early 80s, which was important for me. And it was by Alistair McIntyre. And he said, you know, liberals, you know, can't deal with problems of conflict in society, and they need to understand virtue, the way in which we look at the good and virtue in society. And he dealt with this historically. Problem is that, so this was 35 years ago, and I wrote a review essay, it was one of the first things I had published. The problem is that he, in talking about virtue, again, didn't really talk about power, didn't talk about how power was a factor and how virtue was understood in ancient Greece or by Aquinas or, you know, in any context. So I, you know, my title for my review essay on After Virtue was After Politics, because he just didn't come to terms with the fact that if you're going to talk about virtue in societies, you have to talk about power, you have to deal with politics, and he didn't, and he too ran away from politics. He was, by the way, a lapsed Marxist when he wrote this book. I mean, he just, okay, so on the one hand, you know, people, sort of conservatives didn't really address questions of power. On the other hand, people on the left didn't really adequately understand questions of ethics adequately. Certainly, Foucault did in his own way, but only through, you know, imagining ethics as power and power as ethics, and not really providing a political purchase point on that. Problematic. I focused on ethical questions not as abstract concepts, but rather as the question of what do you do if you're a democratic citizen. Assume that freedom and equality are pivotal to democracy, they always have been. But unless you sort of reify what those concepts mean and have those control democracy, you want to sort of have them filtered into democracy, in which case they think about, well, okay, if you're a democratic citizen, you want to preserve freedom, well then freedom to do what? Equality with respect to what? These are always questions, and they aren't answered by democracy itself. So, I want to talk about the ways in which this was addressed historically. And one other point before going to the chapters is that and I just actually thought about this the other day. It's just a little catchy, so I thought I might as well bring it up here. But one of the things that people have always worried about when they've been worried about democracy is the tyranny of the majority. Now, when people have used that term, do they ever talk about an example of that? No, they don't. I can't think of the tyranny of the majority as an initial movement in politics. I mean, even with, even in Germany, people thought about Germany, obviously Hitler won by a minority, 35% of the votes, and then, so he blew up the political system, and then, well, we know what happened after that. Rousseau was a critic, the sort of the modern founder of democratic thinking, was a critic of sheer majoritarianism. And in fact, democracies have experienced not tyranny of the majority. It's not because they're stupid and unethical. The people are stupid and unethical, but democracies have suffered from tyrannies of one kind of minority or another. It's been tyrannies of the minority all the way down the line. So anyway, so again, I've been interested in trying to articulate sort of a democratic ethics that would mean something that wasn't tied to conventional forms of ethical discourse for politics. And my interest in activity is also supplemented by the following thought, and that is that one of the ways in which people often think about democracy is in terms of consent. That, I mean, if you look in a dictionary, democracy is the consent to be governed. And Jefferson talked about the consent of the governed, right, in the Declaration of Independence. Now, it's a nice idea, right? If, in fact, the governed are in a position fully to judge and control those whom they are supposed, insofar as they understand are in a position to control those who govern. Otherwise, it can't mean anything. But by and large, people are not in that position, right? At this, in representative democracies, individuals vote. We vote for individuals. The individuals sometimes vaguely respect the positions that they campaigned on. And in between, we are constantly subjected to attempts to shape our minds by advertisers, people who give money to politics, donate money in politics, the people in power themselves. And so the idea that consent is completely free and authoritative in our society does not help us understand, even theoretically, does not help us understand what's going on for democracy. And so I thought, better, so in this sense, I go back to my Greek roots, which aren't genetic, they're just intellectual, and in Athenian society, the citizens were actively enacting democracy on a regular basis. And I thought that's the only way you can really talk about the people having powers, if they're in a position to do that. And in fact, my next project is sort of interested in formulating an idea of what I call existential democracy. Anyway, so I focused on activity, and that led me to understand history, and history as a record of what people have done. Not that it's good, bad, or anything like that, but that it is what people have done, and that we should keep that in mind rather than reinventing the wheel or forgetting the good ideas of the past or the experiences that people have had in democracy, in democratic life. And the other thing that I noticed, as I said before, is that in different periods of history, democracies have sought to supplement their own activity with some particular kind of ethical concept. So for the ancient Greeks, they in Athenian democracy, they overthrew the power of the aristocrats and the oligarchs. But the aristocrats and the oligarchs were really enamored by the idea of excellence, starting from Homer, etc. And they didn't. And in Athenian democracy, people didn't give that up. And the idea of excellence was not. It was understood in a human, in terms of human excellence and also political excellence. And the problem was if that notion, not that anyone in Greek democracy ever rejected the notion, but they tried to democratize it so that it wouldn't be associated with a particular group, as in an oligarchy, or a particular conceptual form, which would limit their capacity to act and change. Okay? So virtue remained important for them, but it was really very much a contested concept. But it was there, and I don't think it, it's ever really disappeared from discourse. I mean, if you're a Democrat, you still, even academic Democrats still grade papers, and so the problem is not excellence in the classroom. The problem is when that is reified in the political arena. And so, anyway, so virtue is one of the ideas which, interestingly, has continued to be important. And David Brooks actually, I don't know why I'm paying attention to him. I guess because I don't know. But he has this book, The Road to Character. They've talked about character and stuff. And when people talk about virtue and character and that sort of thing, these days, they tend to understand it in very individual terms, individualistic terms. Build character, use effort, be responsible, all this stuff, and that's what virtue is. Well, actually, the Greeks didn't understand it that way. They understood it in very political terms. What kind of social practices are needed in order for the society to be excellent? And that is always, I think, a consideration in politics, how to make things better, so to speak. And so that was one idea. The other, then, democracy sort of went into hibernation, and then reemerged in early modernity when it was co-opted by people who wanted to legitimate the modern state. And they did so through the idea of representation. The representatives would be the voices of the people, and that their capacity to filter the voices of the people from their standpoint as representatives would make the society better. So indeed that was you were supposed to believe in your representatives, were the founding fathers, we're supposed to respect them, and of course the founding fathers are also, interestingly, actually contradicted themselves, at least in the Federalist Papers, because Madison said, oh yes, the representatives are going to be virtuous. That's who we need in our society. And then, as he said in number 10, in 51, he says, oh well, actually, when you get people in power, they're going to care about their own interests and their own place, and so what we have to have is a separation of powers because we really can't trust anybody. So it's sort of kind of funny. I mean, on the one hand, there's this, paean to representatives, and then a recognition that once in power, people don't act so virtuously. So, but anyways, representation is important and unavoidable in modern societies, right? We're not in a society of 300,000 people. We're in, huge society. So representation is a reality, but it is not, but it is going to be a challenge to democracy always, because it can easily itself become reified. So the people who have power are the representatives rather than the people themselves, right? And so there's always has to be this dynamic between, or a dialectical relationship between representatives and the people, which actually was something that was promoted by the anti-federalists and the early states, actually, in the United States, particularly Massachusetts. They had this idea that basically, representatives would be on their horses, it was traveling to and from the legislature and, consulting with the people. But that's not, that didn't, well, put it this way, they did lose, right? And they weren't wonderful people anyways, in an unqualified sense, they were slaveholders too. So, but representation, again, is this idea which, if it gets reified into a concept, then you are not talking about democratic ethics. You're talking about some sort of, elite ethics. And I'm not interested in that. I guess I tend to share the view of, in fact, in some respects, Plato and Aristotle and Machiavelli, as not to mention Marx, that in fact, if you look at a society, you're probably going to get a better political judgment out of the many than you are out of the few. And the problem is that societies aren't constructed to facilitate that. With this idea of civil rightness, it's just I just made it up. And it was, I wanted to wanted to think about equal opportunity in a way that didn't make your eyes glaze over. And equal opportunity is actually always hitched to an idea that if you have equal opportunity, then the people who succeed in getting through the gates, so to speak, will have succeeded on the basis of merit. So there's an ethical ideal always associated with equal opportunity. So I talked about this as civil rightness, as something that was important in the 19th century. It emerged in the 19th century as a way of trying to figure out, well, how can we have democracy in a civil society that's becoming more and more open to participation by more and more groups, labor groups within racial minorities, etc. Now, actually, but again, here's a problem in terms of the double-edged character of every conception of ethics that's associated with democracy. The idea of equal opportunity, Tristan might have found this in one of the pages of the book, but it's a myth. I mean, the idea, not that it's not realized, but how can opportunity be equal? Everybody's different. It can't, any more than you could, when Marx talked about the problem with equal rights, right? That equal rights provides an equal standard for unequal individuals. So everyone's opportunities are completely different. So the only idea of equal opportunity is something that is established by some institutional, authority. And that's a problem. So it obviously gets redefined. There's people on the right who emphasize equal opportunity in terms of individual effort, people on the left who talk about it in terms of structural conditions for the possibility of genuine equal opportunity. But as far as I'm concerned, it's just a way of people trying to identify what is a good standard for excellence in civil society, for the activity for practical activity in civil society. And in that sense, it is like these other ideas. That is to say, you have to figure out, well, okay, you're going to hire someone. How do you hire someone in a way that's democratic? How does Harvard decide on its admissions policy? How does, all these things are real issues, and they're not easily parsed. So that was that idea. Then I said, and it turns out, that that's the 19th century. That comes out after the establishment of representation of democracy, which came after the Greek idea of virtue in democracy. And none of these ideas got left behind. They all just get recast, by different and different iterations of democracy. And so then I talked about legitimacy, and there I said, well, you know, we're asked to think about legitimacy in terms of the state in the 20th century. You think of Weber, who started talking about the state in the 20th century. And the problem with legitimacy as an ethic is that yes, it's necessary. I mean, we can't really do without states, I don't think. On the other hand, the way in which states are constituted these days is radically anti-democratic, right? I mean, you know, I'm sure it's more than half of the federal budget, right, is dedicated to the military, right? And that has nothing to do with you know, the well-being of the people, except, I mean, to some extent, you know, there's a need for security, but I mean, we don't need the 700 bases, right? We don't really need the 700 bases for democracy. So there's a problem with the legitimacy of existing states, and yet we need the state. So how do we think about democratizing the state? So that's another ethical question that I talk about. And I talk about, I use the word goodness here because goodness actually has a practical resonance to it. I mean, for example, you know, if you go to Bed Bath and Beyond, you want to decide on, you know, what's a really good coffee maker or something like this, or a good knife. You know, it's something that works well, right? It's not only something that is, you don't look for a moral coffee maker, you look for a practically functional coffee maker, and so that's what, and so it gets away from the moralistic potential that might be associated with what I'm doing in the book. And then with human rights, I wanted to address the question of the coherence of human rights in relationship to democracy. And it's an issue because we are, you know, in a transnational political arena. We are bombarded, you know, by images of people suffering all over the world and wondering what the hell are we going to do about this. We have these human rights covenants which tell us, you know, how we should make everybody happy. But in fact, if you, let's just say, look at human rights discourse, first of all, there is, as Raymond Gorse, one of my teachers, pointed out, right, there is no, the concept of human rights is white magic, because the only way in which you can make a claim for human beings is in relationship to a particular political order, at least these days. But if you do that, then you have particularized humanity in some ways. So there's no, it doesn't work. But on the other hand, we know that in some ways it's a useful discourse. If we want to talk about, yeah, the suffering that people in the caravan are experiencing now is real. We can't really talk about it as American suffering since we're causing it. I mean, suffering that's comprehensible in terms of American political ethics since we're causing it.